So while we're talking about shadows, I think it's really important to talk about the whole ego complex, because the shadow is just part of the ego complex. And the way that Carl Jung looked at this is a wonderful way to look at this. He looked at shadows and the persona, or the mask that we wear, the part of ourselves that we're familiar with and that we present to the world, and the disowned part that we have suppressed, ignored, and denied. It's like the Tao. There's a light side to the shadow, a light side to the ego complex, and a dark side to the ego complex. The light side is the persona, or the false self, as Ken Wilber might say. The dark side is the shadow, or disowned self, that has been cast into the darkness because it's so disgusting we can't think of ourselves as having those qualities. They've gone unconscious where we can't see them. So this ego is like a many faceted jewel. It has so many different dimensions to it. And this is really true in this age. It wasn't always true. Our egos were, for what egos we had, our sense of self was really simple and identified with a traditional religious belief system until the last 150 years, where it's gotten so complicated and so multifaceted. And it's not that we just have one shadow. We have many shadows. In fact, opposite of every persona is a shadow. One of my favorite ways to talk about this is the Jungian by the name of Hal Stone. He was a Jungian analyst, the head of the C.G. Jung Center in Los Angeles. He discovered that not only do we have one shadow and one persona, we have a whole committee of personas and shadows. And opposite every persona is a shadow. He called the persona a primary self, and he called the shadow a disowned self. Now, what his discovery was, is the one thing everybody loves to talk about is themselves. Have you noticed that? Of course, you don't like to talk about yourself, I suspect, but you've noticed that everybody else seems to. That's what I've noticed. So, if we ask these parts of ourselves to speak, if we give them a platform to find their voice and speak, it's amazing what they have to say. They have lots to say. And opposite every one of these primary selves, we can find a disowned self if we dig just a little bit. So in this psychological method called voice dialogue, we're asking the primary self to speak, and then the person doing the facilitating is paying very close attention. So as I assume the voice of a primary self, for example, part of me is an achiever. I like to achieve things. So if I let that primary self speak, the achiever, pretty soon a facilitator that's paying very close attention will notice that there's a hidden self that keeps wanting to say something but doesn't get a chance. And they'll pick up on that hidden self, and then they'll ask to speak to it. Or maybe we're asking to speak to a part of ourselves that we have trouble staying in that actor's role. And the facilitator will notice, I notice you keep slipping out of role. Now this is a clear indication that there's a shadow personality that wants to say something, that isn't getting a chance to say something. So that's exactly where we start digging for that disowned self if we're doing voice dialogue. So, for our purposes right now, this is a wonderful way to look at the ego complex. There's not just a light side and a dark side to a real simple ego. Our egos have become very complex. Now there are many personas. It's like there's a whole operating committee inside me. And opposite every one of these primary self voices is a disowned self that can be discovered. So this is like beginning an adventure, going into a corporation and seeing who's part of the executive team, who reports to the CEO, what is that executive circle that's making the decisions. And it's like behind every person on the executive circle, there's someone that is the opposite perspective of the person on the executive circle. And it's a matter of discovering what these primary selves and what these disowned selves are. This can be an incredible adventure. It can be an incredible exploration. So that is one method of doing shadow work, of bringing what's unconscious into consciousness.